Evening. Thank you for being here, attending this session. On behalf of Docomomo Macau, I would like to thank, first of all, Rui Foundation, which hosted us here. Thank Rui for his initiative of letting us know something more about the book that is the subject of this session. Thank you, Cecilia, Shu, and Bernard, for being here as well from Hong Kong and helping us to further understand and to discuss these matters that has got to do with heritage, how to maintain building architecture. So we are looking forward to further talk and further conversation and above all discussion about these topics. So without further ado, I will invite Rui to talk and let us know something about why is it important to extend the life of the buildings. Is it something that is worthwhile, a question mark, or is it already something that is a fact? It is worthwhile extending the life of buildings.
Well, thank you, Francisco.
You're welcome.
I think the question mark is there provocatively, because if it was for us, there would be no question mark. But the problem is that it seems like these lessons don't get learned and don't get transmitted. So we are always starting to make a conversation. And this was the theme of the 5th Docomomo seminar, which is a bigger whole-day event that we, Docomomo Macau, hosted almost annually in the first years. In the case of the 5th seminar, I think because of the appropriateness of the title and also of the speakers lineup that we set up that we had, we thought after the conference that it was worthwhile to publish the proceedings. So the proceedings are like a little introduction or workshop on how to extend the life of buildings. And this very often in Macau, I come across these questions of and I mean, a lot of us who are in the sector and dealing with heritage, why, what is the criteria for first to protect or safekeep buildings, and then the second question, which also is very recurrent, is why keep these buildings when they are either run down or they are not being used as they were initially planned. So regarding those questions, I think the first question of what criteria, and when I was in the urban planning committee, that was kind of the question that came every time we have a historic building. There is no criteria, where's the criteria? Cultural Institute, tell us what is the objective criteria. And always I was trying to make a mini lecture every time the question came up, which was, there is no objective criteria. You need to make the assessment, you need to make the study, and that's why we need to make this research, a specific research on buildings. And regarding the second question, I think it has to do with several things. Is not an easy issue. Why the buildings should be restored or reused or repurposed and not demolished, but I think it's very obvious that it is a civic responsibility, not only of architects but of everyone, not to demolish buildings as a first option, because first, the buildings are, it's normal that buildings, the original function of buildings gets wasted, and there's a lot of old buildings in cities around the world where old monasteries, old seminars, old barracks were converted when they were not used anymore in their original use into universities, into hospitals, and government buildings, and so on. So, you know, that is a kind of meaningful because the buildings are not just a functional packaging like, you know, the cornflakes box that you buy in the supermarket. A building is an essential cultural product. And everyone in Macau should know that because we are a city of full culture heritage. And so this is a first central, essential understanding of the meaning of buildings because they are a complex and important activity, human activity, done collectively and done with the knowledge of the place. So in not only in the architectural or design point of view, but in terms of craft, in terms of understanding of the place, in a lot of different layers, all the people, all the stakeholders who come and build a specific building, they are bringing their knowledge and they're putting it together. So it's a very significant and complex artifact that talks about the capacity of the city and the moments in history of that city. And that is terribly meaningful for us to just dispose of it. It's actually absurd. It's like if you have a painting and it's dusted on the wall and you say, just throw it away. It's dusted. It's not well maintained. So the second, and I think more important apprehension is that when we demolish a building, we are producing a horrible amount of pollution. And so before we do that, we should make proper assessments on how to reuse that. So the book was about trying to put these ideas across in a simple way, or at least in a broken down way. The first paper is by Sheridan Burke. She is from ICOMOS International, and she was one of the experts that was assigned for the renovation of the Sydney Opera House, thus our poster. She was involved in this big operation that happened recently in the 2000s, and so she came with all this example of how you can adapt and reinterpret the building, and what you need to understand, what you need to respect, what you need to take a step further, and so on. So it was a very specific approach. Then Professor Imon was also our speaker, and he brought in basically the methodologies that in the IFT Heritage Management course, which unfortunately it's a course that it's closed, it's not running anymore, but was for many years running in Macau and was responsible for probably the most important part of the government cadres who are working with heritage in Macau, coming from this management course of IFT. And so he was bringing to the table these methodologies of how to assess the buildings and the sites and so on. And I presented a quite different point of view, which is the work that's a part of the work that we're doing in Docomomo Macau, which is making the assessments on buildings which are in risk of being intervened or demolished. And so I presented on a petition and a request for classification that we had recently submitted to the Cultural Institute in Macau government with the support of ICOMOS 20th Century Committee, and then I mean, not going into detail on that, but where we make this argument of the uncontested universal value of the building. And we did that on the 5 points that are in the Macau Heritage Protection Law, which I list here: the importance of the building as a noteworthy lived experience and embodiment of history. 2, as the intrinsic aesthetic, artistic, technical, and material value of the building. 3, the architectural concept of the structure and its urban integration. 4, the interest of the building as a symbolic testimony. And 5, the social scientific importance of the building as a source of knowledge. So these 5 points, which are in the Macau law and which are, let's say, a universal understanding of how to make the assessment of uncontested universal value, which is like a thesis that you should run when you want to protect or to classify a building. This is the response to the simplified question: how do you classify? Which ones you protect? Which ones? How do you know? No, this is the structure of the research. And then, of course, this has to do, in the case of the Rainha Dona Leonor block, also with the understanding the contribution of the author, which was a gentleman from Macau, José Lei, who went to Hong Kong, opened a practice there. His father was an important architect in the Public Works Department. And so that was the history behind the book, what the book summarizes. And this comes after a previous little book that we published in 2019, I think, or 20, which is this Macau Modern Architecture book, Walking Guide. Another book that also took us over 4 years to get together. It's a very big challenge. Sergio is on these adventures of publishing books on Macau heritage. I don't recommend to anyone to publish books because it is a nightmare if you're not a professional. We're doing this as amateurs. Is really a nightmare to get all the science together. It's a learning process. And so here we are finally launching our book. I'm very happy that this comes to fruition, and I'm very happy that we have with us 2 people that are really important in here in the region in going through and understanding these kind of issues. Thank you, Francisco.
Yeah, thank you. So, going from Macau, that we all understand the specifics, the context, we follow all these challenges on a daily basis, like Sergio and Rui mentioned. So we hope hearing a little bit about your experience, not only in terms of teaching, but also in terms of reflecting and how is your experience about Hong Kong, and how is Hong Kong dealing with those challenges. So Bernard, I understand you will you will be able to tell us first something about it.
Yes. Can you hear me? Oh, is it working? Okay, thank you, Francisco. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Docomomo Macau, for inviting us. We're very pleased to join you. My name is Bernard Brennan, as Francisco mentioned. I'm an architect, a professional architect working in Hong Kong, originally from Ireland, and I worked in the UK for a long time before moving to Asia. So I have worked principally on adaptive reuse, kind of in heritage contexts. And in recent years, I have also been teaching on the conservation program at Hong Kong U, teaching the studio for design for conservation. And Cecilia and I were colleagues in Hong Kong U for some time as well. So the topic we chose to share with you today is something that we have been discussing in Docomomo, Hong Kong, recently because of some topical cases that we're dealing with. And we thought this was quite interesting kind of reflection on the themes of your book, and thinking about kind of transnational processes in adaptive reuse and heritage conservation of the modern movement, and how these kind of exchanges might enrich our perspectives in Hong Kong. So the topic, as you can see, it's the lives and afterlives of public housing in Hong Kong. So the next slide, please. Do I have a? Oh, can you do it, Maya? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I've just prepared a few slides very briefly to share this some of our reflections on this this topic as it relates to Hong Kong, and I hope that maybe in the discussion we can learn something from your experience, particularly the case that you outline in the book, the Reina Donna Leonor project, which I think could be relevant for us. So I want to share with you briefly some current processes in the conservation of mass housing internationally, and then reflect a little bit on the kind of patrimony of modern mass housing in Hong Kong, and some contemporary challenges in terms of the adaptive reuse and conservation of this type of architecture in the Hong Kong context. So in recent years, this modern mass housing, which was built in the post-war decades across the world in great quantities, has been reaching the end of its service life. And it is presenting a major challenge to municipal governments all over the world, where there has been kind of welfare state programs building mass housing. So this is a famous case which you may well be familiar with. It was published very widely, the Park Hill estate in Sheffield. This was listed by the UK government in the year 2000, I believe. And at that time, it was the largest listed building in Europe, a really vast estate built in the late 1950s, and using a lot of the ideas current in the modern movement at that time, some of the discourses of Team 10 and the work of Le Corbusier, you know, these kind of elevated walkways and so on. Are employed in it in a kind of very innovative way. So a very valuable building, modern building in the UK context. So by the end of the 20th century, Park Hill was experiencing a lot of dereliction, and it was acquired by a private developer and renovated in phases. So these phases have been ongoing over the last 10 years or 15 years. The first phase completing in 2011, and then more recently in 2022, the second phase completing. So I think it's an interesting case. Of course, I won't go into too much detail now talking about this, but it kind of shows the development of techniques and practices in the adaptive reuse of mass housing in the UK context. So the first phase was criticized in terms of the amount of original fabric that was removed, some of the treatment of the surfaces, and also some technical issues in terms of thermal bridging, which is a major issue in the northern countries with architecture of this kind in colder climates. Not something that we have to be concerned with in Hong Kong and Macau. But a lot of these issues were addressed in the second phase, and it kind of shows the development within professional knowledge and practices in this field over this period. It's something that is, you know, becoming more kind of standard practice. And in the last 10 years or 15 years, there have been a lot of cases published, prominent projects adapting the architecture of this time. Some of them often require the sale or the kind of privatization of these buildings and their sale as private dwellings in order to fund the very expensive conservation works. This photograph in the center, a famous building also in London by Erno Goldfinger, the Balfron Tower, was developed by Telford Homes, a private developer, and sold as high-end residential. This project was criticized for the kind of gentrification process associated with this, and also for some of the changes they made to the heritage fabric, removing the original windows, for instance. The image on the left is a project in the Netherlands. This was also privatized, but it was made into affordable housing. The architects renovated the external envelope and made improvements to the ground floor. As you can see in the image, they kind of opened up some of the closed facades on the ground floor. But the apartments inside were sold at very affordable rates to buyers who did DIY for the interior renovation. So this was a kind of affordable housing solution, a kind of innovative project in this way. And then on the right, a project in France. This was quite widely published. I should think you've seen these projects by Lacaton and Vassal. These estates also from the 1960s, which were retrofitted with this external loggia. This, rather than the other examples, these ones remained as social housing. And it was innovative in that the tenants could actually remain living inside during the renovation. They did not have to be decanted, which is very disruptive, obviously, in projects of this kind. So during this period, of course, there has been an increasing discourse in the conservation of mass housing within civil society and within professional groups, including, of course, Docomomo. There have been many editions of the Docomomo Journal dealing with mass housing. And this interesting declaration from one of the chapters in Europe a few years ago, beginning to recognize not only the material fabric, the value of the material fabric and the kind of architectural and historical values of this architecture, but also its value, its social value as a kind of the egalitarian politics embodied by these buildings as kind of housing for the poor people in society. So some points from this declaration are noted. Advocating that speculation with land and housing should be restricted, and that these projects should be seen and financed as a public and social responsibility, while also recognizing the preservation of the building fabric, as in terms of more traditional kind of architectural conservation approaches. Okay, and then finally, just looking at international cases. I'm from Ireland, as I mentioned. I was in Ireland last week, and I met a number of colleagues who are now working on retrofitting modern housing in Ireland, for example. And this so it is now a widespread process. The retrofitting of these, the conservation and retrofitting of these buildings. Sometimes it involves densification. This, because there is a housing shortage, like the project on the left. You can see they're adding new dwellings in extensions or on the roof extension. Or sometimes it is improving the thermal envelope to improve the energy efficiency. This is a major topic, as I mentioned, in Europe, where the weather is colder and there is a big energy requirement for heating these buildings. And this really is seen now by municipal authorities in Europe as very much the top of their agenda and a major focus of their investment, of their capital investment in terms of dealing with providing housing. Okay, so then thinking about Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has this extraordinary heritage of modern housing, I'm sure you may be aware. So this vast housing program in Hong Kong is kind of unique in the world, as being one of the largest. Started construction in the 1950s, following the influx of refugees coming after 1949. And it went through several phases of development, starting with these very simple resettlement blocks. You may have seen, like Shep Kip Mei, project in Hong Kong, refurbishing one of these a few years ago, and then moved to more sophisticated examples in this kind of high modernist style in the 60s and 70s. And the housing program in Hong Kong continues to this day. There is still the Housing Authority building public housing in Hong Kong today, whereas in many of these other welfare state societies, these housing programs stopped in the 80s and 90s. So in Hong Kong, similar to Europe and elsewhere, these buildings are reaching the end of their service life. And there is a kind of dilemma as to what to do with them. And this happens alongside a land shortage in Hong Kong. And there is kind of extreme pressure. Often these projects are occupying very valuable and desirable sites, like the case in Wah Fu, this extraordinary site on the south of Hong Kong Island with views over the sea, very attractive to real estate developers, potentially very valuable. So there is a dilemma now facing these projects. Zooming in slightly, one example that we would like to share with you briefly is the Choi Hung Estate. So these are some images which Cecilia shared with me. I think a colleague of hers from Chinese U found these in one of the historic government reports. So this is the Choi Hung Estate under construction, and some photographs of the apartments inside. So it was built in the early 60s as part of the Housing Authority's low-cost housing scheme, designed by a local firm, Palmer and Turner, and overseen by a British architect, James Fraser, who was also instrumental in Singapore's modern housing programs before. So this was a revolutionary project in Hong Kong at the time, providing much better quality housing standards than the earlier resettlement block type buildings, and also amenities like social amenities, schools, retail, and playgrounds and public spaces, and so on. Some more photographs from this report. So you can see that originally it was painted grey, but later, Choi Hung, I understand, is rainbow in Chinese. Later it was painted in these rainbow colors. You can see in the bottom right-hand image in the 80s. And the image of this facade with the rainbow colors with the playground became quite iconic and is today like a major Instagram site, and actually the scene of music videos and photo shoots of all kinds, and even like in the MTR, there are advertisements with the Choi Hung in the background today. Okay, so in 2023, the Hong Kong government, the Housing Authority, announced plans to redevelop the Choi Hung Estate site. This would involve demolishing the buildings in phases. So in this plan, the pink highlighted area would be demolished first, with the residents moving to off-site, and then over the next 25 years, I believe, the remaining phases would be demolished in sequence, with residents moving into the completed phase, and then the subsequent phase being demolished and rebuilt. And the increase is rather modest. They would provide 9,200 flats upon completion, which is a 1,800 net gain on the site. Okay, so this proposal has inspired quite a lot of debate in Hong Kong, and I'll share some slides now from a report produced by a group, the Save Choi Hung Estate Group. This is led by a colleague of ours in Docomomo, Hong Kong, Don Hong. So Don and his colleagues produced this report, which I believe is in the public domain, to look at the value of Choi Hung and to try to advocate for its conservation. So an image here showing the arrangement of the estate with these, which is made of these tall blocks, and a low block in dark red. And then below that there is this retail street in dark green, and then the school and the wet market and car park in the blue and purple at the ground floor level. Okay, so like what Roy mentioned in the campaign for the Rania Dora Lenore housing block, in the report they have used the Hong Kong Antiques Advisory Board standard criteria for listing buildings to reflect on the value of Choi Hung, with a view to kind of advocating that for its retention. So I won't go through these in detail, but architectural merit, they draw attention to some innovations, architectural innovations such as these play areas in the typical plan, group value as an ensemble, this kind of modernist ensemble. Historical interest, they discuss some of the important historical events. A visit from Richard Nixon, including he went there to play badminton. So I think a lot of dignitaries, Hong Kong was very proud of these estates, and a lot of visiting dignitaries were brought to see them. It was a major source of kind of legitimacy for the Hong Kong government historically. And very interestingly, they have also documented some of these retail shops. A lot of these shops have been in continuous use, with the same proprietor since the building was completed in the 60s. So they really are very unusual for Hong Kong, to have shops that go for 50, 60 years. The turnover is much higher usually. They really are, very interesting, and rarity. Okay. So also in the report, they begin to look at how in the Choi Hung case we might take, some of the examples I presented earlier, where in other countries they are, rather than demolishing, they are kind of achieving, an increase in density by extending somehow, or building new buildings on the site, or doing roof extensions and so on. So they begin to just speculate on that, and they suggest that just by adding a few stories of roof extension, for example, you could achieve this 1,800 additional units without demolition. So just finally, we're at the beginning of this process in terms of looking at Choi Hung, assessing its value, and thinking about how it might be in some way retained. But some challenges that we and colleagues in Hong Kong see. I should say that I asked for the advice of a colleague, Geraldine Denning in Hong Kong U, who has done a design studio on Choi Hung to give some suggestions. So some of these are also in discussion with her. So some challenges are technical. Of course, the structure. The existing structure, like the high block, the structure is actually shear walls, whereas the low block is a column and beam structure. So it's the low block is easier to retrofit structurally, but the structural capacity we understand is likely to be able to take some extensions. MEP services would be a major challenge, and may require a deep retrofit of the MEP, may require people to be moved out. And then the shape of the building, the deep plan shape with single aspect corridors is something of a challenge to adapt if we were changing the circulation or the kind of the arrangement of units. the existing units are quite small, as you can see. Yeah, so if they were being made larger, that might be a challenge. Okay, and then perhaps more importantly, and this is something I think perhaps that Cecilia may elaborate on, are also the challenges in terms of public perception and political reluctance for experimentation. These are the real challenges as we see it. So I think in Hong Kong, people are so used to the kind of demolition development process that they find it hard to imagine retrofitting as an option. So when you ask residents in the estate how they feel very sad about losing their neighborhood that they love, but they think it's the right thing to do because history moves forward, they want a new home, and they think this is the only option. So public perception is a challenge, but also in the professional community, even professionals in Hong Kong are very skeptical about the feasibility of adaptive reuse. They think that it's just not something that can be done feasibly, affordably, within time, within kind of technical constraints. And then political reluctance to experiment. It would take some courage on the part of the government authorities to break from tried and tested processes. So this is something that we have to try to deal with in the Hong Kong context as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernard. I think that is a really rich already, the presentation. So I think that in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to one of the later slides that I have prepared. Is it possible from over there to jump to slide 12? Without going through everything? 12. You're going to go through everything. Because I'm going to skip the beginning part of this part of the presentation. I'm going to jump through this part. So what the discussion so far that you have presented, we're going to stay with public housing. It reminds me about a very early conversation we had when you first arrived Hong Kong, that you told me that you were a little bit surprised or shocked with the ways in which how people relate to modern heritage in this place, which is very different from maybe in the UK or in Ireland. And I don't quite remember how our conversation goes. But to me, this is always something it interests me because it's also very different also from Canada, which is where a place I stayed for a long time. In Hong Kong, I think in 20, 30 years ago before I left, nobody heard about or nobody would think about heritage. And nobody would think about public housing would be something to be preserved. But this is still very based on a more conventional approach, monumental architecture and all of that. But then suddenly, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, obviously because of the handover, there is a shift towards the past. The ideas of ordinaries, collective memories and all of that is sort of deposited in some of these buildings that we otherwise thought of not monumental. They're very, maybe even run down with a lot of the tenement houses. So I began very interested in these questions in the mid-2000s when I started to do my own research. It was my PhD in architectural histories to try to understand how come, what is it really about these buildings that made people suddenly became very fascinated. So there is a kind of a little bit long-winded beginning, and I mean the reasons, without too much explanation, I think a little bit here in Macau as well, that there was this sort of, there has been a movement towards understanding the ordinary buildings and landscapes because of rapid change, right? With urbanizations and with now the political, the sovereignty, the handover, all these periods that made people become interested in embracing and understanding how to create an urban identity. So this is a picture taken in 2007, before the Mayhole House was preserved. And I was kind of looking at a lot of young people who have never lived in these estates suddenly thought that these are our heritage. This is not actually something, not places that they had really personally engaged in. So I find that's quite a powerful sentiments. But at the same time, also troubling a little bit because there was sometimes we conflate different things in different eras into just heritage, right? There is this sort of ideas of nostalgia as well. So I became interested in participating in Docomomo and understanding these questions about how do we values and how our values about buildings has changed over time, and how through this sort of quite powerful movement towards trying to find the identity, we also begin to change our aesthetic assumptions, our aesthetic values of places, and that actually can be changed. So that put into question of, well, you know, what kind of modern architecture is considered to be valuable? So we did a few series of activities in Docomomo, Hong Kong. This is back later on in the late 20-teens. One of them is called Architecture We Love to Hate, which is to take people around Hong Kong to look at buildings that otherwise, normally, people think that they're pretty ugly. When we talked about modern buildings in Hong Kong, I mean, nowadays, of course, a lot of architects and architectural scholars are interested in, you know, to understand the values and to try to mobilize for their preservation. But if I talk to my parents and grandparents, they would look at these buildings and, you know, just really question that, or like, why are these buildings important? There were this idea and assumptions that buildings are pretty ugly. So we had this series of tours. We chose quite a few buildings that's kind of debatable. Some of them were slated for demolition. And then to ask these series of questions, like why are certain buildings being deemed ugly and worthless by some groups of people, but then, you know, treasured by others, and maybe increasingly so. What are the bases for forming these different opinions? How do judgments made by professionals and the general public then begin to affect the perceived values of the built landscapes and their fate of development? So there are some really interesting examples in the last few years, such as, I'm sure you have heard about the State Theatre. You know, some of our colleagues here are actually personally involved in the conservation of that project. That's a very interesting example, is that before people pay attention to that building, so a lot of people walk by that building and just think it's really ugly, it's very run down, there's no values, it's not worth preserving. But then a group of local activists started to mobilize for the preservation, and they started to gather and document the building, gather opinions and memories of the buildings, and interview famous figures to talk about the buildings. And then so very quickly, awareness was raised that people began to look at the building differently, started to appreciate their values, and find something that they think is actually quite concrete, that they could relate to this building. So there's a shift of historical relations towards the landscape. So this is some of the activities that we did in Docomomo. This is back a few years ago. For the State Theatre, again, there was a talk that we try to understand, to debate about the values of that, and also the Central Post Office. There's another event we coordinate with HKU. It's kind of to be provocative about post office. This is actually a sarcastic comment because the government was at the time, well, actually now this building is still slated for demolition, is to demolish this post office, which was built in the 1970s, kind of a modernist building to make way for a shopping mall at the waterfront, another shopping mall, right? So the idea is that, well, maybe shopping mall is, of course, it can raise the land values, right? Do we need a post office anymore at this day and age? So the poster here is asking, do we still need a post office? But the debates really is geared towards asking, do we really need another shopping mall? And what does the post office really represent? It represents actually a commitment to public service. It's not necessarily, yes, you know, people today may not go to the post office so much, but it is about public assets and about public goods and about what is good, is about the social betterments and what kind of things that do we need. So this brings back to the questions about public housing, which we talked about, Bernard showed earlier about Choi Hong. There's another very famous public housing, is Wafu Estate. Did you show the Wafu Estate earlier? Just
I showed very briefly.
Briefly, yeah. So interestingly, both Wafu and Choi Hong they're slated for demolition over a very long time, which is a bit unusual. For the next 20 to 25 years, you think this building is going to be gone, but you still have another 20 years to look at that, which is a very very limbo situation. So when the building was announced, both Choi Hong and Wafu, and this is Wafu, which is a bit earlier, it prompted quite a lot of conservationists and academics and social activists to try to come and understand and document the buildings and try to, because we're talking about these days Hong Kong identity, collective memories associated with built heritage. So these groups of people, including a lot of my colleagues at HKU, and they propose a series of activities to engage with the local residents to try to document the everyday practices of these people. And there is also a photographer, Michelle Chan. She is interested in photographing building fragments like the one on the left, posters in there, but also places that are important, little places that are important to the people. These are very different kinds of photography, visual practices, not the heroic architectural photography, but everyday spaces that can invoke what Wafu as a place is really about. This is another recent exhibition called the Wafu Lounge by the architect Sarah Mui. Similarly, it's about the different ways of documenting a place to try to really accentuate the intangible connections of a place, that arouse, as a way also to arouse awareness of the value of this building. And at the end is to ultimately ask the questions, do we really need to demolish the whole entire site? Or are there ways that we can work with the existing buildings, like what some of the drawings that Bernard showed you earlier? So this brings to the question about what I'm interested in architectural education, right? What faculty in the Department of Architecture and Architectural School can do. So Geraldine Denning, that Bernard mentioned earlier, is this architect who has done a lot of proposal for refurbishing public housing in the UK, that she's now teaching at HKU. And the left two are two of her syllabi that just started last year to look at both Wafu and Choi Hong as a site for students to rethink what are the possibilities of refurbishing, revitalizing these buildings without demolishing everything. So students were guided to propose alternative proposals to these. So I think this is a very, very interesting move. And I believe that these studios will be further developed in the next few years. On the right is another studio that also concerned with public housing. This is by my colleague Natalia in landscape architecture. They're looking into the context surrounding the public housing to rethink what are some of the better ways to improve the environment to enhance the current situation. So Geraldine Denning, she started this a group in the UK before she came to Hong Kong called ASH, which is Architecture for Social Housing, right? So this is one of the projects. It's called the Save the Estate for the St. Raphael Estate community, in which she did very detailed studies along with her colleagues to calculate the different footprints and carbons, the cost of demolition, to prove that it's more expensive to build than to an alternative ways to preserve the buildings. So she, based on the knowledge that she gained from the several projects that she did, she then encouraged our students to make these proposals. Now, this proposal might look a bit fanciful, right? Bernard and I both have seen some of the results, and we were at the reviews. Of course, you can critique them. Some of the students were, I think that is a convention of architecture education, that architects always feel, and students coming to architecture program, they need to design something. They need to design something exciting, fanciful and spectacular. So some of the projects are pretty spectacular, maybe too much. Actually, it's not really doable. So part of my own personal comments in looking at this review is to, well, how can we take seriously how the new relate to the old? what is a respectful relationship? Do we really need to wow the reviewers? Like, do we really need to design something really that fanciful? I mean, this is probably even more kind of crazy. But nevertheless, I think that it's really interesting to see someone like Geraldine and Natalia and a lot of other colleagues that in the last 2 years, kind of the two projects, Choi Hong, these public housing projects became a catalyst for more academics working in architecture departments to rethink about how to extend the life of buildings, right? Going back to the topic, and really about adaptive reuse. Aside from the technical calculation, what else do we really think about? It is really the relationships, about the stories of the people that could eventually change maybe the more collective aesthetic assumptions and and the collective assumptions about what the city really needs. So I think I would just end it there, because I'm sure maybe this will be there will be a questions and discussion. Thank you.
Really very interesting, and we can see how you both focus on critical matters that concern modern architecture in Hong Kong, residential, the housing, the estates, and also public buildings, equipment, this kind of, like the post office, which was subject to this long debate that was held. We followed here as well. But Rui also mentioned something that is unique here in Macau, the Rainha do Leonor, the building, which is a kind of a unique building. It was not replicated within for that long. But so it's also a matter of not a mass development, but a unique development that is worthwhile looking forward and looking at the way as it was intended to build, and as it was represented, as it represents now, a symbol of modern, an outstanding symbol of modern architecture in Macau. So we are dealing here with two topics, which is mass construction that Hong Kong shows us. Sometimes unique buildings that have smaller scale for Macau helps us, but we are aiming to define a common criteria, which is important. Is it feasible to deal with these both realities when we're talking about lowering density of the city, of these buildings, and you are talking about increasing the density as a way of survival, of feasibility of this project? So what do you think about this? Through different means, can we achieve a common goal? Rui, you may start.
Before I let them address the specificity of your question, one thing that somehow both of you touched, and I think it's really interesting in this issue, is how when the political decision on retaining buildings or demolishing and building anew, how to a great extent in our societies the idea of the new project is used as a propaganda, because it does not have any relation to the narratives and the issues associated with the existing fabric. It's something new. It is politically used, the project, as something that is going to clean and bring a kind of this idea of progress or a new lifestyle or whatever. And in fact, the stigma of the present, which is our social responsibility, because we did not take care of the buildings properly, we did not have policy for them to be properly taken care, we did not adapt them during the years. So all of that stigma is not discussed, and also the discourses raise the same issues. And so we're using architecture, I think in a lot of extents, the architecture become more relevant and interesting politically and socially, because it is being used as propaganda to erase the issues that the existing fabric raises. and just trying to blind everyone with with a beautiful future, which in the end means no natural light, no environment, pollution, pollution, pollution. And really this culture of demolition, along with the culture of war, is what is destroying the planet.
I think that, I mean, you raised really interesting, but also I think to me a complex question, because this idea of erasure, the idea of building new and to promote aspiration has always been also part of modernism, right? In the very early 20th century is about erasing, it's about doing something new. But I think that now even politicians, right, and of course architects themselves, is being forced to reconcile in some way, or at least a beginning, that we need to pay attention to the environment, we need to pay attention to carbon, all these environmental questions. So it then opens up some room for, and then the public, if the public cares, if you mobilize this sort of ideas that extending the life of buildings is something really important and also good for the environment and community, if you can prove that works. I think now we have a bigger opening for politicians and developers to be convinced, because they need legitimacy to succeed as well. And part of the legitimacy is increasingly depend on addressing issues of the environment, right? So if, I think like in Geraldine Denning's work, it's quite interesting because she's trying to prove that adaptive reuse can save money. Adaptive reuse can reduce carbon. Adaptive reuse can make community happier, right? These are beyond just technical assessment. These are like, of course, claims, but these also sometimes, at times, in part, depends on working with community, making proposal that is powerful and compelling to get politicians and developers to buy into it. And that is the effort and part of the responsibility for architects and conservationists and activists and community members themselves to play a part to make that loud and clear in a convincing way. But it requires commitment, including like our educationists, right? Like we are teaching architecture, that you need to instill that idea and then teach students, get students to actually really actively work on these issues.
Yeah, I really agree with Cecilia's comment. I guess what we're talking about is maybe like the truth claims, or the kind of the narratives of neoliberal urban processes. You know, like what you're saying, Rory. You know, selling a dream of this new, clean, improved, better urban environment. And then people accept that. Like what the government is proposing for Choi Hong would be a nightmare for the people living there. The people living there are very elderly, mostly, and they're proposing to move them all, which is extremely disruptive for elderly people. And the whole estate itself will be an enormous building site for 25 years with a lot of pollution and noise and disturbance. So a lot of these people in 25 years, they will be no longer around, but really the last decades of their life will be worsened a lot by this proposal. And yet these people are kind of in favor of the proposal, because they're not aware of that there is an alternative, that there might be an alternative. So I think what Cecilia is describing, like about kind of offering alternative narratives of urban change, is very important. And I was thinking, like as Cecilia was mentioning, like modernism was about the new and about radical change, but the values of modernism were not those of the neoliberal project. They were egalitarian values, so I think that's what we need to get back to. Like, we need to get away from the cynicism of postmodernism, to be very theoretical. Different topic. But I think if these kind of philosophical, kind of perspectives, I think we do need a change to deal with the environmental crisis and to deal with the kind of social crises of caused by this kind of speculative-led urban development. Yeah, and maybe just to address Francisco's point about like conservation, like what I understand you're asking is like maybe in the case of the Reina Donna Lenore project, this is a very rarefied building, very beautiful architecturally, and in this case, I imagine perhaps it would not be appropriate to like add on roof extensions and overclad the facade to make it bigger. It would not be appropriate in this case. So I think but it's what is appropriate. It's a question of what are the values of that building or that place, and I guess in some cases the values will be the architectural values, the aesthetic values of the facades and so on. But another as we're talking about this kind of value of social value, of this kind of modern housing. If the value of these mass housings, it's really as a place for people to live, as a place for a community to live, and for social housing. So maybe this kind of we talk about values-based conservation management. This kind of theoretical framework for thinking about what is appropriate that comes from that. Is helpful maybe in deciding what to do with different heritage places, because like even some of these examples I shared, these earlier examples, they saved the building, but they made it into apartments for the rich in order to pay for the refurbishment. Yeah. So these were very criticized. So I personally like some of these projects that even they involve actually quite invasive changes, like to the original building, like the Lacaton Vassal project. The original facades are removed, which would be would not be appropriate for normally for a conservation project. But in some ways, they kept the community. So the social value is protected. The architectural value is less than the social value. To put it in those terms, those heritage values terms. But I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. In terms of these kind of mass housing sites. But that's not to say that they're without architectural value. Like, we don't have time to go into that in detail today, but some of these projects in Hong Kong, they were really by the best architects in town at that time. Donald Lau and P&T actually, they're great architects in the region. So they're not without architectural values as well, which
I just want to say that something maybe a little bit controversial, because I think, of course, in any conservation projects, we need to, as a necessity, you need to define the values, you need to define the significance in order to write up a statement, right? But values also change, right? And then sometimes it's difficult to grasp. And so there is always a danger about celebrating certain kind of values and significance. So for sometimes in architectural writings, to accentuate the architectural values, like the Park Hill, right? The Park Hill is an interesting example. I wrote something about it, although I don't know enough about that project. That Park Hill was originally is a social housing, right? This is representing the social commitment in the mid-20th century to elevate the lower and middle class to have a good place to live. So now it's being refurbished, and 2/3 of the housing estate goes to kind of more elite class. It's privatized, right? So, and the project has been celebrated very extensively in the architectural circle to praise like how well it's being preserved, how beautiful the techniques of preserving the building, and to some of the architects, there was this sort of almost nostalgia. Like, now Park is revived, there's this sort of seems to reassert the significance of architecture and the role of the architects. But At the same time, I mean, I'm quoting from this one of the architectural academics, Jeremy Tills in London, that he was quite critical about this sort of over-celebration of just the architectural values. The social value is there, but it's not being really seen very closely as things have changed in the current economic climate. That is not being seen as important. It's almost like a lip service that, well, the building is revived. Now we can revive its social function. The social function, yes, it serves social functions. It can be used again by maybe a new groups of users. So it's great, right? But then it somehow is original intent, the original commitment to social betterments that represents the post-war decades of this very important commitment of modernism, of architectural modernism itself, is somehow lost. So I think that is an important thing to still, we need to be a little bit more critical about it. What kind of social values do you serve? Which groups do you serve? How do you really kind of ensure, or maybe you cannot really fully do that to serve the same functions and to revive the same values. But nevertheless, at this time, when there's so much social inequalities going on in the world, how do architects think more critically about their really ethically to try to commit to that cause?
Definitely. Very good. So I think it's time to open to the audience. I'm sure that you'll be willing to raise some queries, some questions, please. The floor is yours.
When we talk about mass housing, and when you talk also about adaptive reuse, mass housing will be always housing. Where how can you call this adaptive reuse? Because the purpose will be always to be housing. Instead of if you have some kind of the post office, there is a building. You can talk about adaptive reuse. Maybe the use can be another one. Because I'm used to work in adaptive reuse, but in buildings, not exactly in mass housing. Mass housing, we can refurbish the building, we can put better conditions, but will be always housing for whatever social, and then can become for rich people. You can, 2 units join in one, and this is what has been doing nowadays in Portugal. And I imagine in the future in Macau, we will have then adaptive reuse when they spoke about in the management plan to have the industrial area, and they try to put it, refurbish this in housing. Then you have adaptive reuse really. Because in other situations, housing will be always housing, and this is also in the memory of the people, because social values always have to do with this kind of attachment to what was before and what will be in the future. And always the equipment around can have adaptive reuse, in fact, to serve a purpose. And this purpose must be related with the people living there. Because I believe in these situations, the social aspect is important. And the people living there should be always heard. They should always, during all the process, be inside the process, whatever you do. And I'd like to have your opinion, what is going on in Hong Kong related with this? Are you transforming also industrial in housing, or just housing in housing, and the role of the people living there? Thank you.
So we would like to accept the challenge of the question by Marie-José.
Yeah, I guess the term adaptive reuse is maybe, if it's still housing, like you can say the tenure is changing, and maybe it's more retrofitting, I guess. But in asking about Hong Kong and what's happening in adaptive reuse in Hong Kong, it's quite limited, I would say. It's quite limited. One housing project was changed into a hostel. You may be familiar with the Shep Kip May estate. maybe this is the only one I can think of, the adaptive reuse of housing. So this was changed into a hotel effectively. There's the police married headquarters is a kind of housing. This was changed into a kind of arts, cultural center. But the number of projects are small in Hong Kong. Like, first of all, there is not that many old heritage buildings really, compared to Macau even or elsewhere. And then also the building regulations and the kind of professional kind of procedures are really geared towards new construction. So any adaptive reuse project is technically very challenging. Winnie can attest to that. Our collaboration on an adaptive reuse project in Hong Kong was very complex and costly for a private developer, perhaps prohibitively so. So I think a challenge in Hong Kong is probably to reform the building regulations as well to deal with retrofitting. Like certainly industrial to residential would be a very interesting one in Hong Kong. There's a huge amount of industrial buildings in Hong Kong, and they're quite unique typologies, high-rise industrial buildings that were made in the post-war decades when made in Hong Kong was a big light industrial manufacturing period. And this is a really big building stock now, and they could make fantastic apartments, but there would be, this is something that should be researched. I think some colleagues are researching it, but
Maybe I'll just say a couple of things. Sometimes I get a question about, Hong Kong is very famous for having a big public housing program, right? Almost 50% of the people live in public housing. But it's also a city that is very famous for having housing shortage. Like, there's subdivided housing. There's always not enough people having, a decent place to live. So that's a really big irony and also contradiction. So housing scholars have studied this phenomenon, and the reason, the explanation generally, is that yes, it seems that the government is spending a lot of effort to try to provide new public housing, but actually it is also at the top, so at the bottom level, right, for the poorer people, that you try to kind of provide this housing, that whoever is qualified, but at the top, they're actually encouraging developers to build private housing for the wealthy. There's actually not enough middle income or lower middle income housing. So those people, some of them are not really qualified for public housing. And that's the only choice is subdivided flats. And the queue, the lineup for the public housing is also very long. So that housing shortage, the problem can only be explained by, well, the authority itself is committed only to provide public housing for a certain segment, but it's not actually working at the top. So it's also producing at the same time simultaneously of housing shortage. So I won't want to get into the kind of complexity of the housing issue, but it is a very complex equation in there. But adaptive reuse is, as Bernard said, is very limited, and the idea is still that all the construction industry is geared towards building new housing. But these days, there is also this MIC, which is the transitional housing, is to use vacant lands that is waiting to be developed for 3 years to 6 years to 10 years, that you can build transitional housing using the materials that can be reconstructed, can be reused, I guess, not adaptive reuse, but reused again. So that's another open up an interesting questions about housing provision, using something that is can be adaptable, right, be transferable.
I would. So still time for a last question.
I had a question regarding the challenges of retrofitting. I understand, as an architect, I understand what are the technical challenges. I won't say easy, but can be grasped in terms of a technical and methodological approach. Also understand what are the difficulties on the challenges of finding the financial means to promote this type of projects. Where I would like to hear a little bit more from you is the challenge that are put it by the social issues related, especially with these mass housings, regarding the strategies of either relocating the population, keeping the population. I saw one example that Bernard showed that people were moving from one building to the other while they. So I like to understand better what are the strategies that, for example, the House Authority is putting in practice in Hong Kong and in these big projects.
Well, in Hong Kong, like in the case of Choi Hong, they will build a new building nearby first. Then they move some hundreds of people out of one area of Choi Hong into the new building, demolish this part of the Choi Hong estate and rebuild. Then they move a new group of people into this part like that. So it's decanting, and yeah, that's what they're doing. And I think like in Europe or overseas, often it's necessary to move the people out, particularly if it's mechanical and electrical and plumbing services are being removed and replaced. It's necessary to move people out, which is very disruptive and costly potentially. But there are cases where they have managed to keep the tenants in the building, like the French example, this Lacaton and Vassal example. They build up this new skeleton outside and keep the people living there, and then at some point they knock through and they're putting the new equipments outside. Yeah, they managed to do that. Yeah. Yeah, not preferable. But I guess like something that our colleagues that have done research on the Choi Hong example are conscious of, and like other colleagues in Hong Kong who have done kind of community like ethnographic research in the community, they realize that like moving people out can be very disruptive. Like there's a big value in these places. The people live there for many decades, and they have a very strong community structure. And actually, when you move people out for a number of years and try to move them back, like not everyone wants to move back. Things move on, and actually it's very damaging for this kind of social relations, networks of social relations. So so this is an issue. Not only a technical issue, but an issue in terms of yes.
Very good. Any last question? If not, Cecilia, Bernard, Rui, thank you so much on behalf of Docomoma Macau. Thank you for your time and very, very fruitful session that we had here.
Thank you.
Thank you.